Hello and welcome to Church at Home with Rachel for Thursday, the 20th of April. Today, I want to talk about a little something that's very specific, I think, at the moment to Canada, but something that our neighbors to the south might find themselves dealing with in a not too distant future. And that is the topic of land acknowledgements. Um, if you watch any hockey in Canada, and now that the NHL playoffs have started, and you see any hometown teams, quite often, especially if Edmonton, Calgary, Winnipeg, in the West, you'll hear a land acknowledgement at the beginning of the game. I was going to say service. Because for me, the opening rituals of hockey are very liturgical. So um, we have what's called a land acknowledgement, and it's the recognition of whose land, of the land upon which we are gathering. And I'm going to share with you the Easter land recognition that we've been using in my churches here at Day Spring Ministry. As an Easter people, we gather together recognizing that we are only temporal visitors on the land that God has created. As a congregation, most of us are not Indigenous. Rather, we are of settler colonial ancestry, and we have benefited greatly from living on Turtle Island with the first peoples of this part of God's creation. We know that we hold an important responsibility to acknowledge the grounds on which we are privileged to gather as we worship the Creator. In humility and gentleness, we acknowledge that we live on this Treaty 6 land that was first shared by Creator with the Cree, Nakota Sioux, Blackfoot, Dene, Sarsi, Saulteaux, and Métis nations. In light of this history and understanding of our role as treaty people, may we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in the spirit of partnership, collaboration, and reconciliation as we learn together and contemplate the possibilities that lay ahead. Now, the actual land acknowledgement is the part where we say we acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 land and name the different peoples who were here long before we were. And to be quite honest, being from the East and moving into a place that has been doing land acknowledgements for a bit more time than we had been used to in the East, it was a bit of a, it wasn't jarring's not the right word, but it was a bit of a like, oh, yeah, okay, we have to do that. Add this to it, become a new habit, a new part of what I do. And now I'm becoming aware of it. At the beginning of an interagency meeting in Wainwright a couple weeks ago, we began. It was almost like I thought they were going to start the meeting with prayer, and then remember, this isn't just about ministers. There's lots of people here, but this idea that we began the meeting with a land acknowledgement, and that this is becoming something that we do on a regular basis, and it needs to be. There are lots of people who are really frustrated with this, and are still struggling with the idea that we are acknowledging the land upon which we gather. I remember the very first time I heard a land acknowledgement, I was in Nova Scotia, in Halifax, and the person who got up, he said, we acknowledge that we're gathered on unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. Unceded meaning it was never given away by treaty, it was never agreed upon, it was just taken. The Mi'kmaq people never said, here you go, we agree to this. The colonial settlers just arrived and did their thing. There's, I don't know for sure, but it seems to be a happy truce right now on the East Coast, that the acknowledgement that this land that we have, put concrete all over and built high rises, is still the Mi'kmaq people's land. And for a lot of people, that's a tough one to take. I remember being, now I could be wrong, so don't quote me on this, but I remember years ago, probably 20 years ago, hearing about a group of Indigenous peoples from around Sawwell Beach in Ontario, which is an absolutely beautiful part of Lake Huron. Beautiful, beautiful beach, very populated in summer. Lots of people had cottages. And it turned out that those cottages had been built on Indigenous people's land. And there was a lawsuit going forward to take that land back. And it wasn't so much, I think, that people were upset that, that the land would be acknowledged as being belonging to the Indigenous peoples, but the fact that all of these people had put in thousands of dollars, they years ago, generations ago, had purchased land, they paid for it, they built houses on it, they contributed to it, they had been going there for generations, and it was their cottage. And now they were being told they might lose all of it and have nothing to show for it. that this land could just simply be taken away. Yeah, it's hard to think that way. It's hard to be the person. I don't know what happened with that lawsuit. I don't know. I still know that Sable Beach is still there. It's still a popular destination in the summer and other times of the year. And I look forward someday to going back and dipping my toes in the sand on that beach. It's one of those beautiful shorelines that you can walk for probably half a mile and never get past your waist because there's so many sandbars. I have lots of good memories of going there to cottages and things like that. But this idea that me as a white person, as a colonial settler, could think, wait a minute, like Rob and I just bought our first house last year, and somebody could come in and say you can't have it, and we're going to kick you off the land because it's ours, and doesn't matter that you put money into it or that you owe money on it or anything like that. Sorry, sucks to be you. Goodbye. That hurts. Like that's scary. The idea that might happen. But then you have to take that particular thought backwards a little bit and think about how did we get this land in the first place? Because we did exactly that. The governments from which the countries from which we came, from Europe, from Britain, from all those places that we came from to come to settle Canada because it was a barren land. Like nothing was happening because we didn't know about it. Well, let's hooey. There was a lot happening. There were millions of people in North America who lived. Some of them lived peacefully. Some of them went to war with each other. They were human beings. We're not going to romanticize the indigenous peoples. They had the same issues we do. Some people liked power. Some people liked to just live their lives. Some people were hunters and gatherers, and others were farmers. Some were fisher people. Like we're not trying to create something here that wasn't. We're not trying to create some idyllic Garden of Eden, North America, prior to white people dropping in and bringing smallpox. That wasn't the case. But what we did do was we dropped in and brought smallpox to a people who were already here, who had children and grandchildren and parents and grandparents, who had celebrations and had wars and had all of the things that we think of in life that we celebrate and we bemoan. They did too. And yet what happened? We walked in and said, here you go, this is the way life is going to be. And by the way, because we have books, we can read and write, we're going to tell you these things to a completely foreign people. In very much, except the fact that we didn't come in guns blazing, how different was that from what we did through 400 years ago, 500 years ago, than what Putin did to Ukraine? We want more land. We want what you have. It doesn't matter that you already exist. We're just going to come in, and by the way, we're going to tell everybody else you don't exist. And if that doesn't work, we're going to lie and say that you're glad we're here. I mean, yeah, people are going to come back on me about that. But really, how different is it? Yes, there were some people, there were some church people who were doing this for what they believed to be the right reasons. But just because we now know they were the wrong, just because we didn't know then they were wrong, doesn't mean it makes it right then. We made mistakes. We caused we caused so many hundreds of thousands of people to die. We caused people to lose their way of living, to lose their identity, to lose their language. And now, when we know better, when we can begin to understand and recognize and acknowledge the mistakes that we made, how is it that a land acknowledgement is so threatening? Our land acknowledgement is not saying, I'm not saying when I say these words that in humility and gentleness, I acknowledge that I live on Treaty 6 land. That does not mean that I'm saying, okay, here you go. I'm giving up my house. I'm going to give it all back. What it means is I'm trying to be understanding and I'm trying to learn, and I want to be in relationship with the peoples who were here before me. And I want to discover where we are called to go, recognizing that even if every single person who lives in Canada who can't trace their roots back 7 or 8 generations were to say to the Indigenous people who could, okay, we're going to give it all back to you. We're going to go someplace else. We're all going to move back to England. Wouldn't they love that? Even if we did that, what good would it do? Wouldn't do anything. The land is not the way it was. The peoples aren't the way they were. We cannot go backwards but we can move forward, and we need to learn to move forward together. And that means we, colonial settlers, need to learn to acknowledge, and we need to learn to be quiet and listen. And we need to begin to do our piece of work, which really is the biggest piece of work required for reconciliation. I recently read something that says to speak our land acknowledgement is a way that we participate in reconciliation. That is what we are called to do. Reconciliation means two parties are coming back together and being reconciled. It doesn't mean conciliation, but it means reconciliation. We're reconciling our differences. We're coming together. We're figuring out how to do things. But in this case, it does mean that we acknowledge that we had the bigger part and we have the longer way to go. For generations, the indigenous peoples have been the ones who have been expected to come and teach us, to come and to talk to us, to deal with us on our land, in our ways, in our systems. Now we're coming to recognize that we need to start going the other way, offering that olive branch. And a small and simple way we can begin the process of reconciliation is by sharing in a land acknowledgement, and sharing it until we actually believe it to our core. Not just words that we write and say before a church service or before a meeting or before a hockey game, but that they become essential to who we are in the core of our being. That we acknowledge our relationship to the land and to the people who were on this land before we were. Once we acknowledge that relationship, we may just then be ready to begin moving forward in this call to reconciliation that we need to have, not just because our government says so, but because God himself, herself, says so. So those are some thoughts, some very preliminary, very off the top of my head thoughts about land acknowledgements and why they're important. What about you? What do you acknowledge, or how do you acknowledge how the indigenous peoples of your area, your province, your state, wherever you're from, have been treated and are being treated? Let me know. Have a great day, and God bless. I'll see you tomorrow for Church at Home with Rachel.